stop for a moment and ask yourself this. When a hungry man receives food and folds his hands before a little girl in gratitude, do you really believe he is calling her God? Do you think he sees her as the supreme divine? Or is he simply honoring the compassion that reached him when he needed it most? Now watch this brief piece of video.
One of the most foolish beliefs is the idea that cows are holy and untouchable animals, often referred to as mother cows. In Hindu society, cows are worshipped, decorated with flowers, and considered divine. Their urine and dung are used in rituals, believed to have purifying and even healing powers.
Mockery can be loud, it comes quickly, it sounds certain, and it rarely stops to think. But a true rebuttal begins somewhere else. It begins with clarity. Here the accusation is simple, that the cow is worshipped as the supreme divine, and that the use of cow urine and dung has no scientific basis. But those are not the same claim, and they cannot be answered as though they are. They must be separated. First, is the cow truly worshipped as the supreme divine in Hindu thought? Second, are cow-derived substances really without scientific basis? Only when the questions are clear can the answer be fair, because understanding does not begin with ridicule. It begins by asking the right question. One of the deepest misunderstandings begins here, that reverence must mean deification, that to honor the cow is to call her the supreme being. But that is not what is being said. It makes a clear distinction. The cow is not declared to be the supreme divine. She is revered, honored, remembered as a mother. And because she is honored in that way, she is not to be slain. That distinction matters, because this is not the language of confusion. It is the language of reverence. The cow is not placed above the divine. She is recognized within life as a being associated with nourishment, care, and support. So the meaning is not literal deification. It is gratitude. Gratitude shaped into respect. Respect shaped into culture. And once that is understood, the accusation begins to fall apart. This is not about calling the cow the supreme being. It is about honoring a life-giving presence within human life. The rebuttal gives a deeply human reason for this reverence. If a mother cannot feed her child, or if a child is left without one, the cow becomes a co-mata, a co-mother. She helps sustain life. That is not mythology. That is need. That is nourishment. That is survival. In such moments, the cow is no longer seen as just another animal in the field. She becomes a giver, a sustainer, a quiet presence linked to human life at its most fragile. And that is why the language of motherhood appears here. Not because the cow is being called the supreme divine, but because in a real and practical sense, she helps preserve life when life is most vulnerable. And the argument goes further. For many people, cow's milk remains one of the most natural and wholesome sources of essential nourishment. So this reverence is not born from fantasy. It is born from gratitude, from the simple recognition that what nourishes life, what protects the vulnerable, what serves human well-being, comes to be honored. Now the argument becomes practical. For many people, cow's milk remains one of the most natural and wholesome sources of nourishment. That is not myth, that is sustenance. And from that simple fact, the larger meaning begins to unfold. The cow comes to be seen as sacred, as a symbol of life-sustaining energy, not because reason has been abandoned, but because gratitude has taken form. This is not fantasy, it is recognition. Recognition of what nourishes life, recognition of what supports human well-being, recognition of a living being whose role has mattered in human survival. And the argument makes one more point. To revere the cow causes no harm. It does not injure, it does not destroy. It expresses honor toward a being that has given much. So the meaning here is simple. Where life is nourished, gratitude follows. And when gratitude runs deep enough, respect becomes sacred. So the point is not irrational worship. The point is gratitude made visible. And once that is understood, the charge of irrationality begins to lose its power. Then the question turns back on the critic. Why call that irrational? Why mock reverence when it is restrained, ethical, and harmless? That is why the argument arrives at a quiet conclusion. The charge of irrationality is harder to justify than the reverence itself. Now the rebuttal turns to the second question. Is the ritual use of cow urine and dung truly without scientific basis? To answer that, it is important to name the traditional formulation, Panchagavya, a mixture of 5 cow products: milk, curd, ghee, urine, and dung. Not a random collection, not an empty custom, a preparation used in medical and agricultural applications. And that changes the argument, because now we are no longer speaking only of symbolism. We are speaking of substance. The evidence says modern studies have identified verifiable biochemical and microbial properties in cow derivatives such as urine and dung. So the proper response is not ridicule, it is examination. What is Panchagavya? What are its components? How has it been used? And what does research actually say? That's how understanding begins. Not by mocking an unfamiliar word, but by asking whether the criticism itself can stand against evidence. For many critics, the conversation ends the moment discomfort begins. But serious inquiry begins where discomfort ends. Here, the rebuttal makes a clear claim. Recent research has shown that naturally fed cow urine possesses bioenhancing, antimicrobial, and immunomodulatory properties. That does not mean every traditional claim should be accepted without question, but it does mean the subject cannot honestly be dismissed as though it were beneath study. Because once research begins to identify measurable properties, mockery is no longer enough. At that point, the question changes. Not, can this be laughed at, but what has been observed, what has been studied, what has been documented. And here, the study is explicit. What critics dismiss as mere ritual has also become a subject of modern research. That is why the wiser response is not sarcasm, it is investigation. To many critics, cow dung is dismissed as waste, but the rebuttal asks a more serious question. What do the studies actually show? The evidence says that cow derivatives such as dung have verifiable biochemical and microbial properties, and it goes further. It says that cow dung exhibits rich microbial diversity, beneficial for soil fertility, composting, and even organic nanomaterial synthesis. That changes the conversation, because once microbial richness and practical value enter the picture, ridicule begins to lose its certainty. What seems trivial from a distance may reveal, under closer study, real agricultural and ecological significance. So this is no longer just a story about tradition. It is also a story about measurable usefulness. And that is why the charge of irrationality becomes harder to defend. So this scene is not about choosing between ancient tradition and modern science. It is about recognizing that some traditional practices can also be understood as early forms of empirical and ecological knowledge. In that light, Panchagavya is not framed as superstition preserved without reason. It is framed as an indigenous practice serious enough to invite investigation and significant enough to remain part of a scientific conversation. And so we arrive at the final claim. Can all of this honestly be dismissed as something without scientific basis? The rebuttal is clear. That claim does not hold. Modern studies, the evidence says, have established verifiable biochemical and microbial properties in cow derivatives such as urine and dung. And from that, the conclusion follows. It is factually inaccurate to claim that the ritual use of cow derivatives is without scientific basis. Because what we have seen here is not mere irrationality, and not empty ritual alone. It is a tradition that includes reverence, practical use, and growing scientific support for biomedical, agricultural, and environmental significance. So the final word cannot honestly be mockery. It has to be understanding.